works and not by faith only. Likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For if the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to try to work through this context. There's several very important things to notice here that I want to emphasize to you before we get started, really, or as we get started. So notice in verse 14, we're just going to look at a couple of phrases that I think are helpful to us. First of all, he said, notice the way he says this. What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Okay. We're going to talk about what he means by works here in just a little bit. But if you just took that kind of rhetorical question, he says, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? What would be the answer to that? It doesn't. Another way of saying that is a non-working faith does not save us. Okay, that's when he says profit, what does he mean by profit? Well, he's talking, no, it doesn't help other people, but he's talking about before God. So what profit is there in that? So a non-working faith isn't really the faith that saves. Then he goes on to say, can faith save him? In other words, can that kind of faith save him? Obviously, if we're talking about the faith that surrenders to Jesus, that kind of faith saves us, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But his point is, you might think of, can faith alone save him? And the answer is no. We'll talk about this illustration. He gives a couple of illustrations that are really valuable and very practical. But come back down to the end of this. What does it profit? So he says, if somebody comes to your door and they ask you for help, and you say, you know what, I'm really going to be praying for you, and you don't help them, you just, shut the door. That doesn't help them, and that's not pleasing to God. And so he keeps asking this question, what does it profit? Well, if you'll notice at the top here, what does it profit for us to have that kind of faith? Then down here, he gets into the activity, what should be the activity of faith, and he says, what does it profit again? Okay? Now, then he comes back in verse 17. Thus also, faith by itself. Faith without any activity. Now, I will say, you need to realize that James, when he says faith without activity, that's not the kind of faith that saves. Okay? So faith by itself, if it does not have works, and you might even put the word activity there, or action, is dead. And we know a dead faith doesn't save us. By the way, who would have been really familiar with this idea of one God? You believe that there's one God. Jews, yeah, that goes back to Deuteronomy 6:5. It just seems like he has to me, I'm not saying that these writings didn't spread out, but it just seems to me to be a very Jewish, Christian kind of audience. He goes on to say, "O foolish man, faith without works is dead." So I would be foolish to think that faith without, submitting to God or obeying God is the kind of faith the Lord had in mind for his people to have that would save us. And then he's going to bring up two people. What two people does he bring up? Abraham and who? Rahab. So a lot of things we could say about it. Just at the very beginning, though, one of the things that sometimes we hear is, because you have passages like Romans 4, which we'll be talking about Sunday, by the way, but we have passages like Romans 4 where Abraham's brought up and we're told he was not saved by what? Works in Romans 4. But then in James says he was saved by works. Now that's not a contradiction. You have to put it in its context, and we'll try to do that tonight as well. But some people will say, well, Romans is talking about us being right with God, but James is just talking about showing our faith to other people. It's not really talking about justification by God. So we don't need to apply this to us being right with God, but just showing other people. Okay? It's usually the kind of argument. Well, just when you look at who's mentioned, okay, Abraham was a child of God, as he's described here, which seems to focus on Genesis 22. But the other person's Rahab. And Rahab was an alien sinner when she first expressed the faith that she did. So that won't work. So if somebody says, well, I think this is just talking about, showing your faith to other people, I think probably the easiest way to go at this before you get into, well, clearly this faith is about being pleasing to God and serving others, is just to say, yeah, but Rahab's in there. Rahab was an alien sinner. So James' point is not to say only the faith of the child of God. He's saying faith, period. If you're talking about the faith that brings you into the Lord, okay, which would be, the alien sinner obeying the gospel, or you're talking about the faith that you have as a child of God, this is the kind of faith it needs to be. And I think that will be helpful and take care of a lot of that. All right. Let me move on here. We're going to skip that. We'll come back to that thought. So he gives some illustrations. Let's just work through this. When he says, what does it profit? Well, it doesn't profit anything. This is just common sense. If you say, I'm going to profess that I'm concerned about you, but then I don't show it. And it's one thing to say we're reading James 2 and I'm studying with my friend that's not a Christian, and maybe it's helpful to know these things. But it is true that who's James writing to? He is writing to Christians, after all. I mean, it doesn't mean there's not principles that apply to encouraging someone to have the kind of faith that obeys the gospel. It does, but he is writing to Christians. And it is possible, I think, for us to take for granted that, well, I believe these right things, and yet fail to have the kind of faith that he describes. And this illustration is so hard-hitting. It's right up James' alley, because there's no way to get around this illustration. There's no but. That's not true because of this. It is direct. It is dead on. And he's saying, look, we can talk about faith, but how do we treat those who are in need? How do we treat one another? Do we have compassion? Jesus talks about this in Matthew 25. Remember when he says, when you did it or didn't do it into the least of these, you're really doing that with me? And so James, in the book of James, I know we probably talked about this before, but when I read James, and I think this is borne out, and I think you could see it, it feels so similar to the prophets of old, which often would talk about how we treat the orphan and the widow and others. And it also is very similar to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. I mean, there are large sections of James. You could put Jesus on one side and James on the other, and you'll catch it. I mean, as you read through, you'll go, this is very Jesus-centered, because it's practical and it's relevant and it's what it means to be a disciple of the Lord. And so this section, I think about faith, it sounds just like Jesus. And a lot of it sounds like Isaiah and some of the prophets. So you can say the right things, but doing the right thing is really important. Okay, so we kind of covered this in chapter 1. Jody did. But look at chapter 2 and verse 17 of James. He says, even so faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. Okay? I tried to think of some examples, and if you guys have some examples, you can help me with this, but didn't Jesus say that kind of thing often? Let's read some of these passages. So let's take chapter 1, verses 22 through 25. Kelton, if you can get that. John chapter 12, I think it's, I'm trying to remember. I know it's 42. I'm trying to remember that context. John chapter 12, verses 42 through 43. Who would like to? Stephen Thomas, you could get that one. John 12, 42 and 43. Luke chapter 6 and verse 46. Will. And Matthew 7, 21 through 23. Clay. All right. And here's what I would like first to do. We're going to start out with James, but then we're going to get on into Jesus and just see how similar these are.
22 through 25. But prove yourselves doers of the word, and not merely hearers who delude themselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, he has immediately forgotten what kind of person he was. But one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed in what he does.
Nevertheless, many even of the rulers believed in him. Because of the Pharisees, they were not confessing him, for fear they would be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God.
Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not what I say?
Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye who practice lawlessness.
Okay. So what James is saying is what Jesus said. So James is certainly not undermining God's grace. He's trying to show us the transforming nature of grace in our lives. He's saying this is what it looks like to follow Jesus. Now, he's not saying, that any of us are sinlessly perfect. Obviously, later on he'll talk about showing mercy because we've received mercy and all of those kinds of things. But his point is the nature of this kind of faith in James 2, whether you're talking about obeying the gospel or especially if you're talking about serving the Lord. So when he says that's also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead, that's not the kind of faith that Paul's talking about in Romans 5:1 when he says by faith we're justified. So there's no contradiction. He's just having to, look at what James is doing. It's like he's having to separate the idea of faith and works to show you what real faith looks like. He's almost, in a sense, doing an autopsy on a dead faith and saying these two things are having to be separated for us to understand. So again, this non-working faith is not a true faith. Now, I just want to show you the harmony between what Paul says in Romans and what James is saying in James 2. When Paul starts out in Romans, he talks about the fact that they were preaching the obedience of faith. At the end of it, he talks about the obedience of faith. So when Paul says faith, he's not saying, faith without any activity. He's saying the kind of faith that surrenders to Jesus. That's always understood. It's a comprehensive term. It's, this idea of a non-working faith, that's just not a true faith. James and Paul agree on that. They say it in some different ways, but they agree on that. They have a different theme as we've been studying on Sunday mornings. They're addressing some different issues. With James, he's just saying, let's talk about what faith is in our lives. And Paul's there's more he's having to address, but they still are going to end up in the same place. So if in verse 18 of James, what do you get out of that verse? Verse 18. I'll read it. But someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works.
You can't separate the two. I think to your point, some people go here and try to argue and pit one against the other and completely missing the point in the context of the chapter.
Right. So the person who says, I'll show you my faith without my works, James is saying, you can't. How would you show somebody your faith without your activity? You can't. You could sit there and tell them, I have faith, I have faith, I have faith. But without compassion and without love and without service, it's impossible. I think that's James' point. James' point is there's no way to do that. Profession of faith, even though if you have real faith, you'll profess that faith. You'll confess Christ. And if somebody asks you, do you have faith? You're going to say yes. But what I think the world needs to see from us is more than profession. It needs to see us living it. It needs to be something they can witness and observe. And when somebody observes you really have faith because they see it, now they're going to be more interested in talking to you about why they see it. But if you just talk to them and they don't ever see that, that's just undermining and undercutting the whole situation. And that's not real faith. And we're going to get into who else has faith like that. That's a counterfeit faith and can lull a person into overconfidence. All right, so let's talk about verse 19. This is a pretty interesting verse and very helpful. Verse 19, he says, you believe that God is one, okay? You believe the right thing about that. You do well. But then what does he say? Yeah, okay, he says the demons believe and do something else. They tremble. If he just said, well, the devils believe. But he says they believe and they tremble. So there's no question in their mind. So let's think about, can you guys think of some different things that we know from various sections of Scripture that the devils know or demons know? About God, Jesus, or
they recognize Jesus. The miracles and all that. They called him by name.
yes. So they knew Jesus and his power, and they knew who he was. They would have known he was God's son. That's right. Roger?
Or to say something like that. They realize that their power is nothing compared to his. Whenever he decided to send the flock off into the
Pigs.
abyss.
Yeah.
They didn't really want that, but they asked for it.
Yeah. And remember the case where the demons said, Paul we know, and Jesus we know, but you we don't know? In other words, we don't recognize your authority? Go ahead, Kelton.
About them knowing Paul. Of course, Satan being before God in the book of Job.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yes, they definitely know.
Yes. Anybody else? So let's think through some of that. He says it's good to believe in one God. Do you know the demons believe in one God? The demons believe in the deity of Jesus. There's plenty of cases of that. Matthew 8:29, they understand the spiritual realm. If anybody understands the spiritual realm, they do. And you remember they mentioned, back to Roger's point, are you here to torment us before what? Before time. So they know there is a time coming. Actually, if you were to, and I haven't thought about doing this, it would be an interesting study sometime to really go through and analyze all the true things demons know and believe. And not only that, they recognize God's powers has been mentioned. Because they shudder, they even tremble. So, with all of that said, so somebody says, well, I believe there's one God. He says, well, the demons believe in one God. Or, I believe there's going to be a judgment day. Well, the demons believe that. You could just go back and forth. But there's a major difference between what the demons, if you think of belief on their part, and the kind that saves us. Conley?
I remember the story about the fortune-telling little girl that she was screaming out, these two are servants of God Most High, and she kept saying it over and over again.
Yeah.
That demon in her.
Yeah. That's a good one. I didn't think about that.
That's why I had to say it.
Okay, you got it. So, with all of that, what is the major difference? So it's not just what you know, even though that's important to have. All these things are important to have saving faith, right? But what is that difference in someone who has saving faith? Obedient. Okay. Alan?
I feel like 1 Corinthians 13, the lack of love, and like in the case of the demons, you do all these things and not have love.
Right.
It accomplishes nothing.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute. That's a good point to go with it. So, when you think about what true believers are going to do versus what the demons would do, we surrender to Jesus as our Savior, as our Lord. We bow the knee to Him as King. That demons do not do. They may know of His power. What's the motivation of the faithful believer toward Jesus? Why do we do that? Well, this goes back to what Alan mentioned. We do that because we love Him. We learn who God is. We find out who He is. We see what He has done for us. And out of that love, we surrender to Him and we obey Him. Okay? The demons don't have love for God. And they therefore are not going to obey Him and surrender to Him. They know of Him. They know a lot about God. But that doesn't mean they know God in the sense of a relationship. And that could be the case with us. I mean, we can know a lot of biblical truth and we can know a lot of things about God. We can know who Jesus is and still not really give ourselves to Him. Go ahead.
You have to have a working faith. You have to have a faith for your brethren. You have to have the faith for your neighbors and help them if they need it. But I got neighbors that don't work, so I don't know what to do. They don't work.
But what you said about when you look at the faith that saves, that it works. That's right.
Work for you.
Yeah.
You don't just sit there and hear faith and don't use it.
That's right. You're right. So with that in mind, yeah, go ahead, Tyler.
Common translation in the New Testament. In verse 19, you believe that God is one, you do well that even beings believe. Those two words are related to the word faith, but nearly every translation you look at is not going to use faith in verse 19, but it's going to distinguish what it's describing.
That's a good point. Yeah. So it's kind of like categorically, you've got to decide which.
Faith that He's doing the autopsy on.
That's right. That's right. That's a good point. Okay. Verse 21, I want to do something here. So this will help us for Sunday because we'll be in Romans 4. But I want to read Romans 4, 1 through 6, and then we're going to come back to James chapter 2, and we're going to notice, which is really important, verses 20 through 23, okay? Now, one of the things I mentioned to you is some say, well, this is before God, this isn't. We've already said that won't work. Rahab makes that impossible. Really, the whole context of James 2 takes that away. So that's not what's going on. There's some difference in how some term or idea is being used by Paul versus James. They're not contradicting, but there has to be some distinction. Because one says it's not by works and the other says it is. There's got to be some categorical distinction here. We're going to figure out what it is. Remember in our study from Romans that we've talked about how Paul is looking at law of works as a system of justification versus the law of faith or the gospel. And he kind of drops law of and talks about faith and works. But that's what he's talking about there. So we've studied enough from Romans. I feel confident we've got that kind of background in mind. But let's just read these two passages, because somebody might read these to you and say, how would you explain this? In fact, I even know situations where atheists or skeptics bring this up. You know, they talk about alleged contradictions, and this is one that comes up. So it might come up from a lot of different circumstances. So we need to have some idea of what's the deal. So Romans 4, 1 through 6. Who would like to read? Jeremy. Don't smile at me when I'm looking for you. So we'll do that one. And then Stephen Benson, if you could come back and read James 2, 20 through 23 after he does that. Go ahead, Jeremy.
What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, has found? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now to the one who works, his wage is not credited as favor, but as what is due. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness, just as David also speaks of the blessing on the man to whom God credits righteousness, apart from works.
21 through 24.
James 2, 20 through 23.
Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed in God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God.
Very good. Now, they're saying the same thing even though it sounds like they're not. You just have to define your terms. And sometimes we can have the same word, we even know this, and it have different meanings, right? So, look at the things they say that are the same though. They both mention justification, and I believe justification before God. Both of them mention that. They both mention Abraham being counted for righteousness. They both mention, and this is interesting, Genesis 15 in verse 6, which says he believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Now, we're going to come back to this slide in just a minute. Let me mention this to you real quick. What's interesting about Genesis 15:6, that verse is applied to Abraham's life more than one time. And not only that, it's applied to different times in Abraham's life. And that's the thing you really got to see. That statement in Genesis 15:6 is a description of the whole of his life, of trusting the Lord and believing in him. So when it says he believed in the Lord and he was counted righteous, that is, he was forgiven of his sins. This is going to be Paul's point in Romans 4. And he was called the friend of God. If you go back, actually you could go to, let me back this up just real quick. Remember, he's called in Genesis 12, the end of chapter 11, beginning 12. He leaves the Ur of the Chaldees. Hebrews 11 says he was doing that by faith. That's before Genesis 15, but Galatians takes the idea of Genesis 15 and applies it all the way back here to Genesis 12. That's when he first showed faith. Then, when we come to Genesis 15, and then Romans 4 is alluding to that, I actually think Romans 4, which we'll talk about on Sunday, is referencing the notion of them, you remember, believing in this promise of the child. They didn't at first, but then they worked through that. Hang on. Genesis 15:6 is applied by James to him when he takes Isaac up on Mount Moriah. That's much later. So this verse is applied to these different times. Now, why does that matter? Both of these texts, everything is the same, except one says not of works, The other says by works. So here's the deal. There's no contradiction. They're using works as a term, as a concept differently. Remember, Paul is trying to say you're not saved by the law of works. Okay, that's what he's talking about. He's saying, listen, you know, Abraham was saved before he was circumcised, guys. So you can't be binding that. He's saying he wasn't saved because he never sinned or he was flawless. He had to be forgiven. If you'll read very carefully Romans 4, when he says not by works, he means not by flawless performance, not by the law of works. Okay, everybody with me? That's what Paul means. But when James says by works, he's not talking about, you know, the law of Moses or the law of works or anything like that. He's saying that he was saved by a faith that was active. Now here's what's interesting. When Paul says Abraham was not saved by works, meaning a law of works, somebody turn to Romans 4, Jeremy, it may as well be you, and verse 12. Because this is the context where he says he's not saved by works or law of works. He's saved by faith. But read Romans 4 and verse 12.
The father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also follow in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had a while uncircumcised.
Okay. He had it in steps. What are those steps it's talking about? That's obedience. So actually, when Paul talks about the faith that saves, he means what James means when he's talking about a faith that has works. The kind of faith that saves is a working faith. Paul believes in a working faith. You can find it all over the New Testament. He's just saying you're not going to be saved through some system that demands flawless perfection, because none of us are that way. We need to be forgiven. That's what Romans 4 is about. So it's not by those kinds of works. It's not by earning anything or meriting anything, or it's not about living a life where I don't need forgiveness, because we've all blown that one. But James, that's not what he's really talking about. What James is talking about is what kind of faith saves you. That kind of faith is a working faith. So if you just read those verses and took them out of their context, I can see where it might be confusing. But if you understand that what he's saying is, we're not saved by this works-based system, we're saved by the gospel in Romans. But James is real simple here. He's just saying, look, the kind of faith that saves you is the kind of faith that works. Okay? Don?
There's one thing, though, that I think that we will find. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me, and life which I now live in the place I live by the faith of the
Son of God.
God, who loved me and gave
Himself for me. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that idea of crucifixion shows you the kind of faith Paul has in mind is the kind of faith James has in mind. Okay, we'll stop right there.
you want to go ahead and grab a psalm book and mark to number 272, Jesus the Loving Shepherd, that would be the song of invitation. Number 272. We'll sing the first and third verse of that song. Before the invitation, if you would, turn in your psalm book to number 452. He keeps me singing. 452. Me, there's within my heart a melody. Jesus whispers sweet and low. Fear not, I am with thee, peace be still. In all the ebb and flow. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. Soon he's coming back to welcome me, far beyond the starry sky. I shall wing my flight to worlds unknown. I shall live with him on high. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go.
Many years ago, a great actor was given a grand reception in his childhood hometown. While replying to the complimentary speeches that he gave at this reception, he asked his audience if there was anything they specifically wanted to hear from him. A particular story, a particular speech, his experiences in the movie industry, anything. After a moment of silence, a retired preacher in the audience, who happened to be this actor's preacher while he was growing up, asked him if he could recite the 23rd Psalm, which this preacher taught him from a child. A strange look came over the actor's face, and after pausing, the actor replied to this preacher, "I will, on one condition, that after I recite it, you do the same." The retired preacher answered, "I'm not an actor, but if you wish me to do so, I will." Impressively, the actor began reciting the psalm. His voice and intonation were perfect. He held his audience spellbound, and as he finished reciting, a great burst of applause filled the auditorium. As the applause died, the retired preacher rose from his wheelchair and he began to recite the same psalm. His voice was feeble and shivering, and his tone was not faultless. But when he finished, there was not a dry eye in the auditorium. The actor rose from his seat at the same time that this retired preacher returned to his wheelchair. He arose from his seat, and his voice quivered and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, as I recited this 23rd Psalm, I reached your ears and your eyes. But when this old retired preacher, my preacher, recited it, he reached your heart. The difference is this. I know the psalm. He knows the shepherd. He knows the shepherd. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his sheep by name, and he leadeth them out. And when he puts forth his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. And a stranger they will not follow, but will flee from, for they don't know the voice of strangers. Jesus said unto them again, verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep do not hear them. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out, and find pasture. The thief cometh not, but for to steal, and to kill, and to destroy. I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for his sheep. Again, he says, I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep. I give my life for my sheep, and I know my sheep, and I am known of mine. And as the Father knoweth me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for my sheep. How many of you know the shepherd? If you don't know the shepherd, tonight could not be a better time. There could not be a better time than this very evening for you to come forward to know the shepherd. He knows you. He knows you by name. He gave his life. He laid his life down for you. He's not the hireling that's talked about here in John 10. That's from John 10, chapter 10. He's not a hireling that flees when danger approaches, when the wolf approaches. He takes care of his sheep. He gives his life for his sheep. Lovingly, tenderly calling as he, wanderer, wanderer, come unto me, patiently waiting there, Jesus I see. Jesus, my shepherd divine. If you're subject to the invitation, come while we stand and sing.
Jesus, the loving shepherd, calling me now to come.